Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be talking about something it's a subject I've touched on before in videos, but this is just kind of like an updated video on certain things involving the 2019 yearly box office. Now, it's important to note that 2018 was the highest year ever for box office totals in terms of U.S. domestic box office. Now, the foreign stuff I'll go over in this as well, or at least to an extent. But if you want to look at the box office for the United States, which is really where a lot of movies make a majority of their money, is with the U.S. box office because they have to split a bunch of stuff when it comes to the foreign box office with certain things. But they make a majority of their money, or they get a lot more out of the domestic box office as opposed to the foreign. So, looking at the domestic box office for this year, we're hovering. Last year, it was over $11 billion. This year, we're hovering right around the $9.5 billion mark, and we only have about a month and a couple weeks left in the year. So, for sake of argument, let's say 6 weeks left in the year for films. And we do have a couple major releases still left. You have Cats, which is coming out, which I don't even know if you want to call that a major release. That's just kind of a weird movie. Again, I might be doing a Will It Fail on that in maybe another week. And Star Wars Episode 9. Now, if Star Wars Episode 9 tanks, that would be very bad for the yearly box office because if it doesn't do well enough in its opening weekends, if it doesn't make the money that they wanted to make, you could be looking at a $1 billion domestic box office drop for the year, which is not good. It is not good at all. And that is telling of, I think, something that is going to be happening in the near future with film. And I'll go over this a little bit too with the China numbers, because the China numbers are also very concerning in terms of what's happening with the U.S. box office over there. Because Hollywood's been trying to tap into China for years because it's basically kind of it's a final frontier in terms of them being able to monetize all of that because of all the people that are in China. You have what 1.7 billion people or something like that are in China. If you can get money from that, like a good amount of money, then that is a whole other market that hasn't been tapped really to a full extent for a number of years. But we're seeing more and more films now that are bombing, and it's a problem that is leading into another problem. And I'll kind of explain this. Is the idea that we've talked about this before with the way that Hollywood kind of conducts themselves in terms of, especially recently in the last 10 years with the franchise films and the endless stream of remakes and sequels. And this is something that I think needs to be addressed. I shouldn't say it needs to be addressed. It does need to be addressed, but it's something that is going to be addressed financially eventually because people have been saying this kind of stuff for years that we're going to be seeing a film crash. Now, I was apprehensive on that until this year because this year we have seen a ton of bombs that have just um, and the thing is that you have this issue now where we've seen all of these bombs start to happen, and it's been a bit more relevant lately, just because we've been seeing more and more of these films start to tank. Now we can point at the Star Wars franchise. Solo was the first Star Wars movie that was released that actually lost money, and now you're looking at Rise of Skywalker, which again, if that one does not break a billion, I think that Disney will consider that a legitimate failure. Um, so you have that up in the air, which again, Star Wars is one of the biggest franchises in the world, if not the biggest. Maybe second to Marvel at this point, but there's that. You have the Terminator Dark Fate, which just bombed. You have various other remakes that have been in the works that have bombed. Charlie's Angels only made $8 million this past weekend. I don't know if that was projected to be anything outstanding. I very much doubt that it was, but it's still worthy to note that a lot of these movies that they're trying to launch franchises with are failing, and they are failing in spectacular fashion in a lot of cases. And you can point to a number of different things, horrible plot ideas, or the virtue signaling, the message being valued over the story. You can point to a lot of different things on why these various films have failed, but the bottom line is they've failed. And that's really where the problem lies, is that people are not digesting the things that you are giving them uh, to the extent that you want them to. They are not, throwing money at you saying, give me more, give me more, give me more. They're saying, I've seen this already. I don't need to see it again. I'm going to take my money and go find entertainment elsewhere. And this is something that Hollywood is not going to learn from until you have a situation where they are losing money on the reg. And this dip in the box office this year, I think, is going to be telling in coming years. And I think you're going to see an even steeper dip next year, because a lot of the reason why that number is so high is because this year you had 3 major Marvel releases. Each one grossed over $1 billion. Avengers Endgame grossed over the 2.7 billion, I believe. It broke Avatar's record, but you had 3 major releases that all grossed over $1 billion. Now that's total box office. That's not domestic, but you can look at those numbers and say, yeah, they made up a large chunk of that number. Next year, you are having 2 Marvel releases because of the absence of Guardians of the Galaxy 3 because of James Gunn's departure and then return. And you're looking at Black Widow, which I do not expect to make a buttload of money. I think you're looking at tops maybe $600 million for that. And then later on, you have Eternals, which is an untested property, so I would not expect a major return from that. And there are not a ton of major tentpole films. There's no Star Wars films coming out next year. You're not going to see anything involving that, even though some of them, again, they've lost money recently, but you're not going to see anything involving that. I believe the new James Bond is being released next year. That could have a definite boost. And there's a few films that are being released, very high profile films that could make a decent amount of money. I think I forget what the DC films are that are being released next year, but the point is that Marvel has really kept this year's box office from being totally abysmal. If you didn't have even 1 or 2, if you only had Avengers Endgame, if you lost, even though I think Captain Marvel is a shit movie, it still made over $1 billion. If you lose Captain Marvel and you lose Spider-Man Far From Home, you're looking at a lot lower numbers. If you lose Endgame and you only have the other 2, you are looking at monumentally low numbers, a huge dip. And the other thing is, I think that has a lot to do with in terms of the worldwide box office, I think that has a lot to do with the Chinese market as well, because the Chinese market does not react very well to these sort of things. And the problem with the Chinese market is that in a lot of cases, the U.S. market tries to hide or alter things in films to appease the Chinese market. Now, we've seen this recently with Quentin Tarantino, where Bruce Lee's daughter went and complained to the Chinese government that her father, who was of Chinese descent, was portrayed negatively in the film, and therefore that would negatively reflect on China as a country. And that movie was pulled. And supposedly there was an offer put forward for Tarantino to re-edit the film in order for it to be released in China. It was expected to make about $40 million in China after its release. But Tarantino stated that no, if you want to watch the film, you will watch the film that I made. I will not be altering it for anybody. And again, that was a hit, and a lot of films that get released in China, I shouldn't say a lot, but some films that get released in China have that problem, where the Chinese government views it and they say, okay, yeah, no, pull this. We don't want any of this shit. No. Joker was another one too that I don't think they even allowed that to air in China, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong about that, but because they believed it would inspire the people that are protesting in Hong Kong. Which it has. There's been people running around with Joker face paint over there, but the thing is that they can just pirate it anyway eventually. I'm sure the people in China have seen a lot of these movies. It's just that they pirate them off the internet as opposed to going to the theater and seeing them, which means that Hollywood doesn't get a dime, which, again, that hurts their bottom line. Or you have situations like Last Jedi where the movie got pulled after 2 days in theaters and only made like $2 or $3 million. We've had situations like that too. Again, Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained. it got released in China. Opening night, somebody saw it, said it was too violent, pulled it. They re-edited it and tried to release it again, and it ultimately failed because a lot of people had already pirated it or seen it elsewhere and stuff. So ultimately, that movie failed in China. But again, you can look at stuff like they didn't like Last Jedi. They thought Last Jedi was dumb. The in the marketing, they've deliberately tried to hide John Boyega's Finn because black people don't necessarily sell very well in China, or at least that's according to what Hollywood thinks, is that they don't sell very well in China. They don't do very well on the Chinese market. A lot of people have also speculated that's why the character of Rose Tico was included in The Last Jedi, to appease to the Chinese market, because Star Wars has never really done very well overseas, specifically in the Chinese market. But that's the thing, is that the Chinese market is very, very telling in terms of how the overall health of the film industry is, because the film industry is pandering to China. So if China is losing money, or if the film industry is losing money in China, then that means they're losing money everywhere else, because they're specifically pandering to China for the majority of it. So that's kind of where you get to see kind of what those numbers are telling it with. And there's a lot of films that have not been released in China for various reasons, but the ones that do, I forget what the actual count is. I think it's 20 films or something every year that the Chinese government approves for release in China, and again, they're major U.S. releases. But it's a slippery slope, and I think that Hollywood is going down that slope right now. It's starting now. It's starting this year, and then you're going to see it compound next year, and maybe compound the year after that and the year after that, as certain franchises start to wane off. Star Wars is going on hiatus for, God, 3-4 years probably at least, so you're not going to see anything with that. The Marvel movies are starting to wind down now because of Endgame. They're going to keep coming out, but they're not going to be. I don't think they're going to be the money makers that they were, leading up to Endgame. And there's a lot of stuff that's kind of just going on that there's not really anything to replace it. And again, this goes back into another point that I made about, how the superhero film could go the way of the Western, where, they'll kind of fade away over time until you don't see them a lot anymore. And that's the thing, is that Hollywood doesn't have an adequate replacement. So you could see a major box office crash in the next 3 to 4 years, and Hollywood might lose a lot of money. And that is ultimately going to make them change their business practices, which I think is the thing that is going to make cinema better. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, that I want the studios to lose money so that they make cinema better, but bear with me. It's basically the idea of, if you have studios that are hurting for cash, and their franchises are not working, and the remakes are not working, and all the old tricks that they've been trying for the last 10, 15, 20 years are not working, then they're going to start to take risks. And that's what you want, is you want them to take risks. And this goes to something that Martin Scorsese said in his New York Times expose, is that studios have tried to eliminate the amount of risk, which is good from a business perspective. I'm not going to lie about that. It's very good from a business perspective. But from a film perspective, it is not, because if you want to make a truly great film, sometimes you have to take the risks. Nobody was willing to take a risk on Back to the Future in 1983. When Robert Zemeckis was shopping it around. Nobody wanted it. Disney didn't want it. No major Hollywood studio wanted it back then. Then he goes and makes Romancing the Stone. Okay, we like that movie. It made a good amount of money. Hey, let's pick up this guy's project. When it became less of a risk, then they picked it up. Even though it was still kind of a risky film, and the production of it was a living hell. It shows that back then Hollywood was willing to take risks on stuff, because they had a lot of these young up-and-comers coming in, and there were guys that were in those companies that were willing to take risks on those younger people, and ultimately it benefited them, because that's really where we got a lot of our franchise films was the 70s and the 80s. And even into the 90s too. A lot of those franchises, you look at stuff like Terminator, you look at stuff like Aliens, Marvel and them all came later, but Star Wars, Star Trek, but even though Star Trek started in the 60s, the movies and stuff came out in the late 70s and through the 80s into the early 90s. But the point is that they can't keep this current business model going. And we've seen this before in other industries when they have a bubble, and eventually that bubble gets so big that it pops, and that's when you have a crash. And I think you're going to see that in the next couple of years. And I think that's going to be very telling from the Chinese numbers, number one, and from the dip in the domestic numbers, because I want to see what the domestic numbers are at the end of the year. On January 1st, I want to view the domestic numbers for the U.S. box office and compare them. Because again, if we're looking at a $1 billion drop when you had the highest film of all time premiering in that same year, I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem because it should be growing. It should be growing, maybe not exponentially, but it should be going up. It should not necessarily be going down, especially when you had like a 7% increase between 2017 and 2018 in terms of domestic box office revenue. So that's just kind of my thoughts on this, because again, it kind of what really got me thinking is, you had Terminator Dark Fate bomb, and then there's been a fair amount of high profile bombs over the last year or two, and they seem to be getting a bit more frequent when you look at some of the releases and stuff like that, especially with major franchise films. But I want to know what you think. Do you think that Hollywood is in for another box office crash in the coming years? Do you think that it's going to be, one of those like fall off a cliff type of, 1920s Great Depression stock market crash type of things? Or do you think it's going to be something gradual that kind of works its way down into a rut until Hollywood kind of wakes up and decides to do something about it? I'd like to know your thoughts. Again, put them in the comments below. Hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?